Welcome to the desert's most overanalyzed rock pile. Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about a pile of rocks in Egypt that has driven people absolutely insane for about 4,500 years. So go ahead and dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab some water or whatever you need, and let's settle in for a nice long ramble about the Great Pyramid of Giza. The big one, the famous one, the one that people cannot stop obsessing over. And honestly, I get it. It's huge. It's old. It's full of weird empty rooms and passages that lead nowhere. And for most of human history, nobody had any idea what was actually going on inside this thing. Even now, with all our fancy technology and ground-penetrating radar and robot cameras, we're still just kind of guessing about a lot of it, which is deeply embarrassing for us as a species, but also kind of soothing in a way. Some mysteries just get to stay mysterious. So tonight, we're going to wander through this pyramid, room by room, tunnel by tunnel, and talk about all the things we know, all the things we think we know, and all the things we're just making up at this point because nobody really has a better idea. We'll meet the people who explored it, the people who looted it, and the people who got absolutely obsessed with measuring every single angle and coming up with wild theories about mathematical codes and alien intervention. Because of course they did. But let's start at the beginning. Or at least, let's start with what we think is the beginning. The Great Pyramid was built around 2560 BCE, give or take a few decades because ancient Egyptian dating is always a bit fuzzy. It was built for a pharaoh named Khufu, who the Greeks later called Cheops, because the Greeks could never just leave a name alone. Khufu was the second pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, and he apparently decided that what Egypt really needed was the biggest, most ridiculously oversized tomb anyone had ever seen. And he succeeded. This thing was the tallest human-made structure in the world for about 3,800 years. Nobody built anything taller until Lincoln Cathedral in England finally edged it out in the 1300s. That's an absolutely bonkers record. Khufu built something so big that humanity just kind of gave up on trying to top it for millennia. The pyramid originally stood about 481 feet tall, though it's lost about 30 feet off the top over the centuries because people kept stealing the outer casing stones to build other things. Which is very rude, but also very practical, I guess. Why quarry new limestone when there's a giant pile of perfectly good stones just sitting there in the desert? Those casing stones, by the way, were white limestone, polished until they gleamed. The entire pyramid would have been covered in this bright, reflective surface that you could probably see from miles away. It would have been absolutely blinding in the desert sun, just this enormous, shining geometric shape rising out of the sand. Very impressive. Very, look at me, I'm a god king, and I have unlimited labor and resources. But of course, those stones are mostly gone now, stripped away over centuries, used to build mosques and fortresses and houses in Cairo. So what we see today is the rough inner core of the pyramid, the stepped layers of limestone blocks that were never meant to be visible. It's like looking at a building with all the drywall removed. Still impressive, but not quite what the architect intended. The base of the pyramid covers about 13 acres. Each side is roughly 755 feet long, and the whole thing is oriented almost perfectly to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. The accuracy is kind of unsettling, honestly. The margin of error is only about 3 arc minutes, which is basically nothing. How they managed that with ancient tools and no compasses is one of those questions that makes archaeologists start drinking. The most common theory is that they used the stars. Specifically, they probably used the circumpolar stars, the ones that never set below the horizon, to establish true north. You watch those stars rotate around the celestial pole, you mark their positions, you do some geometry, and boom, you've got your cardinal directions. Simple in theory, absolutely backbreaking in practice, because you're doing this in the desert with nothing but your eyes and some wooden stakes and an obsessive commitment to precision. But that's the thing about the ancient Egyptians. They were obsessed with precision. They loved right angles and perfect symmetry and mathematical ratios. They built their entire civilization on the Nile's flood cycle, which meant they had to be good at predicting patterns and measuring things. So when they decided to build a giant eternal resting place for their king, they weren't going to half-ass it. They were going to measure everything down to the millimeter and make sure it was perfect. Which brings us to the question everybody always asks. How did they actually build this thing? And the answer is, we don't really know. I mean, we have theories, lots of theories, probably too many theories, but no smoking gun, no ancient instruction manual, no papyrus that says Pyramid Construction for Dummies Dynasty 4 Edition. What we do know is that it took a lot of people a long time. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about 2,000 years after the pyramid was built, claimed it took 100,000 men working for 20 years. But Herodotus also claimed that the Egyptians paid for the pyramid by having Khufu's daughter work as a prostitute, and that she demanded the block of stone from each client to build her own tomb. So we maybe shouldn't trust everything Herodotus says. Modern estimates are a bit more conservative, probably somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 workers, including both permanent employees and seasonal laborers who came during the flood season when they couldn't work their farms. These weren't slaves, by the way. That's a myth that Hollywood really needs to let go of. The workers were paid. We found their villages, their cemeteries, their graffiti. They left behind evidence of a massive, organized labor project, not a slave camp. The workers quarried the limestone blocks locally, mostly from the Giza Plateau itself. The granite used in the internal chambers came from Aswan, about 500 miles south, which meant loading these multi-ton blocks onto boats and floating them down the Nile. Then they had to get the blocks from the river to the pyramid site and somehow lift them into place layer by layer until they'd built a mountain. The current best guess is that they used ramps, big earthen ramps that spiraled around the pyramid, or straight ramps that got longer and longer as the pyramid got taller. Then they dragged the blocks up these ramps using sledges and ropes and probably a lot of water to reduce friction. There's evidence they poured water on the sand in front of the sledges to make them slide easier, which is actually pretty clever. But honestly, we're still not completely sure. Every few years, someone proposes a new theory involving internal ramps or external cranes or some other system, and archaeologists nod thoughtfully and say, maybe, and then go back to arguing about it. The truth is that the Egyptians built this thing using technology that has completely vanished. No ramps remain, no tools, just the pyramid itself, sitting there smugly, keeping its secrets. The pyramid contains about 2.3 million blocks of stone, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. Some of the granite blocks in the king's chamber weigh up to 80 tons. That's as heavy as a blue whale. They somehow got a blue whale's worth of rock up into the middle of a pyramid. Just think about that for a second. The whole structure weighs about 6 million tons. It's so heavy that it has actually compressed the ground beneath it. The bedrock has squished down under all that weight, which is kind of funny, in a geological sort of way. Even the earth itself couldn't handle Khufu's ego. But here's the thing that really gets me. Despite all that weight, despite being built from millions of irregularly shaped blocks stacked on top of each other, the pyramid is incredibly stable. It's been standing for 4,500 years through earthquakes and erosion and treasure hunters and tourists and general wear and tear, and it's still there, still mostly intact. The engineering is so good that the whole thing settles evenly. The corners haven't sagged, the sides haven't buckled. It just sits there, being a pyramid, refusing to fall down. That kind of structural integrity requires understanding load distribution and material stress and all sorts of principles that we like to think of as modern engineering concepts. But clearly, the ancient Egyptians figured it out. They didn't have the math we have or the terminology we use, but they understood in some fundamental, practical way how to build something that would last forever. Which was the whole point, really. Khufu wanted to live forever, or at least he wanted his body and his spirit to have a safe, eternal resting place. The pyramid was supposed to be his immortality insurance policy, a giant, indestructible house for his mummy and all his worldly possessions, protected by massive stone blocks and hidden chambers and sheer intimidating bulk. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The pyramid was looted probably within a few centuries of being sealed, maybe sooner. We're not sure when exactly, because ancient grave robbers didn't leave receipts. But by the time Arab explorers first broke into the pyramid in the 9th century CE, it was already empty. No treasure, no mummy, just empty rooms and a stone sarcophagus with its lid broken off. So in a way, the pyramid failed at its one job. Khufu built the most elaborate tomb in human history, and it still got robbed. Which is kind of tragic, but also kind of hilarious in that cosmic irony sort of way. You can't outsmart human greed, not even with 6 million tons of limestone. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about who looted the pyramid, and when, and how, we should probably talk about what's actually inside this thing, because that's where it gets really weird. From the outside, the Great Pyramid looks solid, just a big triangular mountain of stone. But inside, it's hollow in places. There are passages and chambers and spaces that seem to serve no obvious purpose. Some of them lead somewhere, some of them lead nowhere. Some of them were clearly part of the original design. Some of them might have been added later, or abandoned partway through construction, or built as deliberate misdirection to confuse robbers. Nobody knows for sure, and that's what makes it interesting. The main entrance to the pyramid is on the north face, about 55 feet above ground level. It's not exactly hidden, but it's not obvious either. Just a triangular opening in the stone leading to a narrow, descending passage that slopes down into the bedrock at a 26-degree angle. This passage is about 3.5 feet wide and 4 feet tall, which means you have to crouch as you go down. It descends for about 345 feet, first through the body of the pyramid and then into the bedrock below. The walls are smooth limestone, and the air is stale and dry, and there's this unpleasant feeling of the entire weight of the pyramid pressing down above you as you crouch walk deeper and deeper into the dark. At the bottom, the passage levels out and opens into a rough, unfinished chamber carved directly out of the bedrock. This is called the Subterranean Chamber because archaeologists are very creative with names. It's about 46 feet long and 27 feet wide, and it looks like someone started carving it and then just gave up halfway through. The floor is uneven, the walls are rough. There's a shaft in the floor that goes down another 30 feet and then stops, leading nowhere. This chamber is weird for a lot of reasons. First, it's unfinished, which suggests it might have been part of an earlier plan that got abandoned. Second, it's below ground level, which is unusual for 4th Dynasty pyramids. Most of the earlier pharaohs had their burial chambers underground, but by Khufu's time, the trend was moving toward chambers built inside the pyramid itself. So why did Khufu start with an underground chamber and then apparently change his mind? Nobody knows. Maybe he decided he wanted to be buried higher up. Maybe the underground chamber was always meant to be a decoy. Maybe it was symbolic, representing the underworld while the actual burial chamber represented the heavens. Or maybe the architects just messed up the initial plan and had to improvise. The Egyptians were very good at building pyramids, but they weren't perfect. They made mistakes, they changed their minds mid-construction. Earlier pyramids from the same dynasties show clear evidence of design changes and structural problems. Sneferu, Khufu's father, built 3 pyramids before he got one right. The first one was supposed to have too steep an angle and started showing cracks, so they reduced the angle partway up, giving it a bent appearance, hence the bent pyramid. Very straightforward name for a very crooked building. So it's entirely possible that Khufu's architect started with one plan, realized it wasn't working or wasn't impressive enough, and decided to change course. Which would explain why there's an unfinished underground chamber, and then higher up, 2 more chambers that actually look like they were meant to be used.
But to get to those chambers, we have to go back up the descending passage and find the secret entrance. About 60 feet from the pyramid's entrance, there's a junction, a hole in the ceiling of the descending passage leading to an ascending passage that goes up into the heart of the pyramid. This passage is the same size as the descending one, still cramped, still uncomfortable, but it climbs at the same 26-degree angle, going up instead of down. Here's the thing, though. This ascending passage was originally hidden, sealed with a plug of granite blocks that perfectly matched the surrounding limestone. When the pyramid was first sealed after Khufu's burial, you could walk down the descending passage all the way to the unfinished chamber and never know there was another way. The entrance to the ascending passage was invisible. Which raises the question, how did the Arab explorers in the 9th century find it? The answer is, they didn't. They gave up looking for it and just tunneled around it. The most famous of these explorers was Caliph al-Ma'mun, who ruled in Baghdad in the early 800s CE. He'd heard legends about the Great Pyramid containing vast treasures and secret knowledge, so he decided to break in and see for himself. He gathered a crew of workers and started tunneling into the north face of the pyramid, just forcing their way through the limestone with picks and hammers and probably a lot of swearing. They tunneled for about 100 feet, making their own passage through solid stone until they finally broke through into the descending passage. But the passage just went down to that empty, unfinished chamber. No treasure, no secret knowledge, just rough stone and disappointment. Al-Ma'mun's crew was about to give up when they heard a sound, a muffled thud from somewhere inside the pyramid, like something heavy falling. They followed the sound and found that one of the granite plugs blocking the ascending passage had shifted, or maybe they'd dislodged it with their tunneling. Either way, they'd accidentally found the secret entrance. So they tunneled around the granite plugs, which were too hard to break through, and forced their way into the ascending passage, which is why today you enter the Great Pyramid through Al-Ma'mun's tunnel, a rough hole punched through the side, and then you awkwardly squeeze past the bypassed granite plugs to get into the ascending passage. The original entrance is still there, but Al-Ma'mun's route is easier, so that's what tourists use. The ascending passage goes up for about 129 feet before it reaches another junction. Here, the passage splits. A horizontal corridor leads off to the right, heading toward what we now call the Queen's Chamber. But straight ahead, the passage suddenly transforms into something much more impressive – the Grand Gallery. If the rest of the pyramid's passages are claustrophobic and cramped, the Grand Gallery is the opposite. It's like the pyramid suddenly remembered it was supposed to be grand. The passage opens up into a corbelled hall that's about 153 feet long and 28 feet tall, with walls that step inward as they rise. It's still only about 6.5 feet wide at the floor, so you can't exactly spread out, but after crouch walking through those tight passages, the high ceiling is a relief. The walls are polished limestone, and there are these curious slots and notches carved into them at regular intervals. Nobody's entirely sure what these were for. Maybe they held beams that supported wooden platforms during construction. Maybe they were part of a mechanism to lower the granite blocks into place. Maybe they're just decorative. It's one of those architectural mysteries that we have decided to just shrug at.
Empty rooms and royal disappointment. Walking up the Grand Gallery, you're heading toward the King's Chamber, which is where Khufu was supposedly buried. But before we get there, let's backtrack for a second and talk about that other passage, the one that branches off toward the Queen's Chamber. The horizontal passage from the junction is about 127 feet long and even more cramped than the others. You're basically shuffling along in a hunched position until you emerge into a rectangular room carved into the limestone. This is the Queen's Chamber, which is a misleading name because no queen was ever buried here. The name was given by early Arab explorers who assumed that the flat-roofed chamber was for a woman, since pointed roofs were supposedly masculine, which is some impressively arbitrary gendered architecture, but whatever. The Queen's Chamber is about 18.5 feet wide and 17 feet long, with a peaked roof that rises to about 20 feet. There's a niche carved into the east wall that looks like it might have held a statue or some ritual object, but it's empty now. Everything's empty. That's the recurring theme here. What makes this chamber interesting is that it appears to be unfinished, just like the subterranean chamber below. The floor is rough, the walls show tool marks, and there's a general sense that the workers stopped partway through. which again suggests that maybe this chamber was part of an earlier plan that got abandoned when Khufu decided he wanted something more impressive. But here's where it gets weirder. In 1872, a British engineer named Wayneman Dixon was poking around the Queen's Chamber, and he noticed some cracks in the walls. He and his team started investigating and discovered two narrow shafts, one in the north wall and one in the south wall, both of them hidden behind the limestone blocks. These shafts are only about 8 inches square, too small for a person, but perfectly sized for, say, a very determined robot. They run horizontally for a short distance and then angle upward through the body of the pyramid at about 40 degrees. They were sealed at both ends, completely hidden, serving no obvious purpose. Now the King's Chamber, which we'll get to in a minute, also has shafts, and those ones were always visible. They were clearly meant to be there. But the Queen's Chamber shafts were sealed and hidden. Why? What's the point of building a shaft if you're going to hide it? The most popular theory is that these shafts served a religious or symbolic purpose. They might have been soul shafts, meant to allow the pharaoh's Ka, his spiritual essence, to travel up toward the stars. Ancient Egyptians believed that the northern shaft pointed toward the circumpolar stars, which represented immortality and permanence, while the southern shaft pointed toward Orion's belt, which was associated with Osiris, god of the afterlife. Which is a nice poetic idea, but it doesn't really explain why the shafts were sealed. If they're meant to allow the soul to escape, why block them? Unless the sealing was symbolic, or unless the chamber really was abandoned before completion and the shafts were sealed as part of moving on to a new plan. Nobody knows. Add it to the list of pyramid mysteries. In the 1990s, a German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a tiny robot crawler up the southern shaft to see where it went. The robot, charmingly named Upuaut after an Egyptian god, crawled about 200 feet up the shaft before hitting a limestone door with 2 copper handles, just sitting there, in the shaft, blocking the way. Naturally, everyone lost their minds. A secret door in the Great Pyramid? What's behind it? More treasure? Hidden chambers? The launch codes for an ancient alien spaceship? They had to wait about a decade before someone got around to actually looking. In 2002, National Geographic funded an expedition to drill through the door and stick a camera through. And behind it? Another door, another block of limestone. And between the 2 doors, a small space containing nothing but dust. Very anticlimactic. The internet was deeply disappointed. But this is what exploring the Great Pyramid is like. It's all dead ends and empty chambers and things that look exciting until you actually investigate them. The pyramid is very good at building up suspense and then delivering absolutely nothing. The northern shaft in the Queen's Chamber also got explored, and it also hit a closed door, though this one was different, smoother, without handles. Beyond it, the shaft just continues, eventually terminating somewhere in the pyramid structure without reaching the outside. So we've got these elaborate shafts that go nowhere and serve no clear purpose, which has led to decades of speculation. Some people think they're ventilation shafts, although that seems unlikely since they were sealed. Some people think they're symbolic pathways for the soul. Some people think they're part of an elaborate astronomical alignment system. And some people, of course, think they're alien technology or secret message conduits or proof of advanced ancient civilizations with lost knowledge. The alien theories are especially persistent with the Great Pyramid, probably because it's so impressive and so mysterious that people have trouble accepting that humans built it with basic tools and an absurd amount of patience. It's easier to imagine that extraterrestrials showed up with anti-gravity devices and precision lasers and just knocked it out over a weekend. But the thing is, we know humans built it. We've found the worker villages, the tool marks, the mistakes and corrections in the stonework. We've found pyramids that collapsed or were abandoned mid-construction, showing us exactly how the Egyptians learned and improved their techniques. The Great Pyramid didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the result of generations of pyramid building practice, each generation getting a little better at it. But I get why the mystery is appealing. There's something comforting about thinking that the past holds secrets we can't understand, that ancient people knew things we've forgotten, that there's hidden knowledge waiting to be rediscovered. It makes history feel less dead, less finished, like there's still something to find. And honestly, with the Great Pyramid, that's kind of true. We are still finding things, just very slowly, and usually less exciting than we hoped. Anyway, back to the tour. Let's leave the Queen's Chamber with its mysterious sealed shafts and head back to the Grand Gallery. We've got a king's tomb to visit, even though we already know it's going to be empty. At the top of the Grand Gallery, there's a horizontal passage that leads into a small antechamber. This room is only about 12 feet long, and the walls have these deep grooves carved into them, 3 on each side. These grooves once held massive portcullis stones, big granite slabs that could be lowered to block the passage and seal off the king's chamber. The stones are gone now, but you can still see the grooves where they slid down. This was the pyramid's last line of defense against tomb robbers. After the funeral, workers would lower these stones, sealing the king's chamber forever. In theory. Obviously, it didn't work because the chamber is very much open and very much empty. The robbers got through. Probably by breaking the stones or squeezing past them or finding some other workaround because humans are incredibly persistent when there's treasure involved. Beyond the antechamber is the king's chamber, and this is the pyramid's main event. This is where Khufu's mummy was supposed to rest for eternity, surrounded by treasure and magical protection spells and all the supplies he'd need in the afterlife. The king's chamber is about 34 feet long, 17 feet wide, and 19 feet tall. It's built entirely from red granite, not limestone, which means every block was quarried in Aswan and transported hundreds of miles down the Nile. The walls are smooth and precisely fitted, the kind of stonework that makes you wonder how they got such perfect joints without modern tools. The ceiling is flat and made from 9 massive granite beams, each weighing about 40 to 50 tons. Above those beams are 5 more layers of granite and limestone slabs, forming what are called relieving chambers. These chambers aren't accessible from the king's chamber itself. They were discovered later by explorers who blasted through the ceiling, but they're crucial for the pyramid structure. The relieving chambers distribute the enormous weight of the pyramid above, preventing all that stone from crushing down and collapsing the king's chamber. It's brilliant engineering. The ancient architects knew that a flat ceiling couldn't support millions of tons of rock on its own, so they built this elaborate system of weight distribution above it. The topmost relieving chamber has a peaked roof which further deflects the weight outward. And apparently, this system works because the king's chamber has been standing for 4,500 years without collapsing. There are a few cracks in the beams, probably from earthquakes over the millennia, but nothing catastrophic. The room is still solid. In the north and south walls of the king's chamber are 2 more shafts, similar to the ones in the queen's chamber, but not sealed. These shafts were always open, running at about 45-degree angles through the pyramid's masonry and eventually opening to the outside. You can stand in the king's chamber and look up into these shafts and see a little rectangle of sky at the end, which is oddly comforting in an otherwise very enclosed and tomb-like space. Like the queen's chamber shafts, these are usually interpreted as soul shafts, meant to allow the pharaoh's Ka to ascend to the stars. The northern shaft points toward the circumpolar stars, and the southern shaft points toward Orion, just like in the queen's chamber. Consistent symbolism, which suggests the architects really did have some astronomical alignment in mind. Or maybe they're just ventilation shafts. That's the boring explanation, but it's also possible. The king's chamber would have gotten stuffy during construction, and airflow would have been useful. Though why you'd need permanent ventilation in a sealed tomb is unclear. So probably symbolic, but maybe practical. We're just guessing at this point. In the western end of the king's chamber sits a large, empty granite sarcophagus. No lid, no mummy, just a big rectangular box carved from a single piece of red granite. It's slightly too wide to fit through the passages leading to the chamber, which means it must have been installed during construction, before the chamber was finished. They built the room around the sarcophagus. The sarcophagus shows tool marks where it was quarried and shaped, and it's slightly damaged on one corner, probably from robbers trying to pry it open or from just general rough treatment over the centuries. Inside, there's nothing, not even fragments of a burial. No evidence that a mummy was ever placed here, though that might just mean the robbers were very thorough. When Al-Mamun's men first entered the king's chamber in the 9th century, they found it exactly like this. Empty sarcophagus, no treasure, no body. Which must have been incredibly disappointing after all that tunneling. They'd forced their way into the most elaborate tomb ever built, and there was nothing to steal. There are various theories about what happened to Khufu's mummy. Maybe it was stolen in ancient times, melted down if it had gold wrappings, scattered to prevent it from being complete in the afterlife. Maybe it was moved to a secondary location for safety, and that location is now lost. Maybe, just maybe, it was never here at all, and the pyramid served some other purpose we don't understand. That last theory is pretty fringe, but it exists. Some people argue that the Great Pyramid wasn't actually a tomb, that it was a power plant or an astronomical observatory or a giant water pump or a resonance chamber for generating energy. These theories are usually based on misunderstanding the pyramid's dimensions and making up mathematical relationships that don't actually exist, but they're popular in certain circles. The mainstream archaeological consensus, however, is that yes, it was a tomb. That was what pyramids were for. Every other pyramid from this period was a tomb. Khufu built a tomb, he was buried there, and then he was robbed. It's not complicated or mysterious, it's just sad and kind of inevitable. But the lack of a body or treasure doesn't make the king's chamber any less impressive. Standing in that space, surrounded by granite walls that have stood for thousands of years, knowing that millions of tons of stone are balanced above you through sheer engineering brilliance, it's hard not to be awed. This room was built by people who had no steel tools, no wheels for transport, no pulleys or cranes as we understand them, just copper chisels and stone hammers and an incredible amount of skill and patience. And they made it perfect. The chamber is aligned precisely with the cardinal directions. The walls are smooth and square. The granite blocks fit together with almost no gaps. It's the kind of precision that you'd expect from a modern building, not from something carved out by hand 4,500 years ago. And there's also something called the air shaft mystery in the king's chamber, which is less a mystery, more just a weird quirk. The shafts, as I mentioned, run through the pyramid at steep angles and eventually reach the outside. But they don't go straight, they bend and twist to avoid the grand gallery and other features. Someone had to plan out these shafts during construction, had to know where they were going and how to angle them so they'd miss all the other passages and chambers. That requires an incredibly detailed understanding of the pyramid's internal structure. The architects had to keep track of everything in their heads or on papyrus diagrams, coordinating the construction of multiple features simultaneously. One crew building the grand gallery, another crew carving the king's chamber, another crew drilling the shafts, all of them working together without getting in each other's way or accidentally punching through into the wrong space. It's the kind of organizational challenge that makes modern construction projects look easy by comparison. At least today we have blueprints and CAD software and walkie-talkies. The Egyptians had none of that, just planning and communication and probably a lot of shouting.
The relieving chambers and Victorian vandalism. Now, about those relieving chambers above the king's chamber. They're not exactly a secret. We've known about them since the 1800s, but their discovery is a pretty good example of early archaeology being less careful scientific study and more blow things up and see what happens. The lowest relieving chamber was actually discovered back in 1765 by a British diplomat named Nathaniel Davison, who was poking around the pyramid and noticed a crack in the ceiling of the grand gallery. He climbed up into the crack and found himself in a low space above the king's chamber, just a few feet tall, filled with bat droppings and dust. This became known as Davison's chamber, because again, very creative naming. Davison didn't find much up there, just granite beams and more granite beams, and the general sense that there was probably more structure above. But he didn't have the tools or the permission to investigate further, so the chamber just sat there for another 70 years until someone with less regard for historical preservation came along. Enter Colonel Richard William Howard Weiss, a British military officer who decided that what the Great Pyramid really needed was a good blasting. Weiss showed up in 1837, hired a crew, and started drilling and exploding his way through the pyramid's interior, looking for hidden chambers and treasures and anything that might make him famous. He was, by all accounts, absolutely terrible at archaeology. He destroyed sections of the pyramid that could have provided valuable information. He carved his name into walls. He used gunpowder to blast through blocks that were in his way. He was basically the human embodiment of 19th century colonialism applied to ancient monuments. But he did find things. By drilling and blasting upward from Davison's chamber, Weiss discovered 4 more relieving chambers stacked on top of each other. He named them Wellington's Chamber, Nelson's Chamber, Lady Arbuthnot's Chamber, and Campbell's Chamber, after various British aristocrats and military figures, because of course he did. Can't discover part of an Egyptian pyramid without slapping some British names on it. The chambers are all basically the same, low spaces between massive stone beams filled with dust and graffiti. But that graffiti is actually important. On the walls of the relieving chambers, Weiss's team found quarry marks, painted inscriptions left by the workers who cut and placed the stones. These marks include gang names, dates, and references to Khufu. This was huge. Up until this discovery, there was no hard evidence inside the pyramid linking it to Khufu. The Greek historian Herodotus said it was Khufu's tomb, and that had been the accepted story, but there was no Egyptian inscription confirming it. The quarry marks in the relieving chambers provided that confirmation. They mention Khufu by name, using his full royal titulary. Of course, there's a conspiracy theory that Weiss faked these inscriptions to make himself look good, because conspiracy theorists cannot allow anything to be straightforward. The theory goes that Weiss painted the cartouches himself, copying Khufu's name from other sources and slapping it on the walls to discover proof. This theory falls apart under basically any scrutiny. The inscriptions were hidden under dust and debris, painted on surfaces that hadn't been visible for thousands of years. The style matches other 4th Dynasty quarry marks. The paint has been tested and dates to the correct period. And Weiss, for all his faults, wasn't clever enough to fake ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs accurately. He was a military guy with a lot of dynamite, not a skilled forger. But the conspiracy persists, because people love the idea that established history is all a lie, and they're the smart ones who figured it out. It's the same impulse that drives flat earthers and moon landing deniers and ancient alien enthusiasts. Contrarianism feels like enlightenment when you're deep enough into it. Anyway, Weiss's blasting campaigns did reveal the full structure of the weight-relieving system above the King's Chamber, and it's genuinely impressive. 5 chambers, each one a slightly smaller than the one below, distributing tons of weight outward and upward until it's finally deflected by the peaked roof of Campbell's Chamber. The whole system is invisible from below. Standing in the King's Chamber, you'd never know it was there. But it's the only reason the chamber hasn't been crushed flat. This kind of structural engineering suggests that the pyramid's architects had a deep understanding of how stone behaves under pressure. They knew that a flat ceiling would crack and collapse, so they built this elaborate system to prevent it. And it worked. 4,500 years later, the King's Chamber is still standing, still intact, while countless other ancient buildings have crumbled into dust. But the relieving chambers also raise questions. If the architects went to this much trouble to protect the King's Chamber, why didn't they do the same for the Queen's Chamber? That chamber has a peaked roof built directly into its ceiling, which distributes weight naturally, but it doesn't have the elaborate multi-layer system. Maybe the Queen's Chamber was abandoned before they got that far. Maybe the King's Chamber was considered more important. Maybe they learned from building the Queen's Chamber and decided the King's Chamber needed extra protection. Or maybe, and this is my personal favorite theory, they just over-engineered the King's Chamber because they could. Because Khufu wanted the absolute best, most indestructible tomb. And the architects were like, sure, we'll build you 5 redundant layers of granite just to be safe. Royal paranoia meeting architectural perfectionism. Either way, the system exists, and it's fascinating, and it's one of the few parts of the pyramid where we can say with confidence, yes, we understand what this is for, and it's working exactly as intended.
Now, while we're talking about Victorian-era pyramid exploration, we should probably mention some of the other characters who poked around inside this thing, because they were a deeply weird bunch. There was Giovanni Battista Caviglia, an Italian sea captain who got obsessed with the Great Pyramid in the early 1800s. He spent years excavating the descending passage and the subterranean chamber, convinced he was going to find secret chambers and hidden knowledge. He didn't find much, but he did clear out centuries of debris, which I guess counts as something. Then there was John Shea Perring, an engineer who worked with Weiss and helped with all the blasting. Perring was slightly more methodical than Weiss, actually measuring things and making diagrams, which is good because otherwise we'd have no record of what the pyramid looked like before they started blowing holes in it. And of course there was Flinders Petrie, who showed up later in the 1880s and was absolutely horrified by what Weiss and the others had done. Petrie was one of the first scientific archaeologists in Egypt, and he spent years carefully measuring the Great Pyramid with incredible precision, trying to establish accurate dimensions and understand how it was built. Petrie's surveys are still used today. He measured the base, the angles, the internal passages, everything, with an accuracy that was remarkable for the time. He also lived in a tomb while doing his work, because he was eccentric like that, just camping out in an ancient tomb, measuring things with his instruments, eating canned food, probably going slightly insane from the isolation. His conclusions were pretty straightforward. The pyramid was built by humans, using the technology available at the time, and all the mystical numerology and alien theories were nonsense, which did not make him popular with the mystically minded pyramid enthusiasts, but did establish him as a serious scholar. Petrie also debunked a lot of the mathematical mysticism that had grown up around the pyramid. See, by the late 1800s, people had gotten very excited about the pyramid's dimensions and started finding all sorts of mathematical relationships encoded in them. The ratio of the base to the height supposedly represented pi. The perimeter of the base supposedly represented the number of days in a year. The internal passages supposedly encoded the history and future of humanity in stone. This whole movement was called pyramidology, and it was wildly popular in Victorian England. People wrote entire books about the pyramid's secret mathematical codes and prophecies. They measured every inch of the thing and assigned mystical significance to every number they found. The problem is, if you measure something complex enough and play with the numbers long enough, you can find almost any relationship you want. It's a form of pattern seeking called apophenia, seeing connections that aren't really there. You can do the same thing with the Empire State Building or the Washington Monument or any sufficiently complicated structure. Just measure it in different units, divide some numbers by others, and eventually you'll stumble on something that looks like pi or the speed of light or your birthday. Petrie systematically went through all the pyramidology claims and showed that most of them were based on bad measurements, selective data, or just making stuff up. The pyramid's dimensions are impressive, sure, but they're not encoding the secrets of the universe. They're just the dimensions of a very large triangular building. But pyramidology refuses to die. Even today, you'll find books and websites claiming that the Great Pyramid contains advanced mathematical knowledge, that its dimensions encode the speed of light or the distance to the sun or the mass of the earth. None of it holds up to scrutiny, but it sounds compelling if you don't look too closely. The appeal, I think, is the same as the alien theories. People want the past to be more mysterious and significant than it actually is. They want ancient civilizations to have possessed secret wisdom that we've lost. It's a form of nostalgia for a past that never existed, a golden age of knowledge and enlightenment that we're constantly striving to rediscover. But the real past is much more interesting than the mythical one. The real ancient Egyptians weren't mystical sages encoding cosmic secrets in their buildings. They were practical people solving practical problems. They wanted to build a big tomb that wouldn't fall down, and they figured out how to do it through trial and error and careful planning. That's not mystical. It's just impressive. And honestly, I find that more inspiring than any conspiracy theory.
Humans built this thing. Humans with copper tools and rope and wooden sledges and an absurd amount of determination. No aliens, no lost technology, just people working together, figuring things out, building something that would outlast them by thousands of years. That's the real mystery of the Great Pyramid, not what secrets it holds, but what it tells us about human capability, about what we can accomplish when we decide to do something difficult, and we commit to seeing it through generation after generation until it's done. But we're not done exploring yet. There's still more weird stuff to talk about, more passages, more mysteries, more theories ranging from plausible to completely bonkers. So let's keep going.
The well shaft and ancient security systems. One of the weirder features inside the Great Pyramid is something called the well shaft. And it's exactly what it sounds like, a rough, vertical shaft that connects the descending passage near the entrance to the bottom of the Grand Gallery. It's about 200 feet long, sometimes vertical, sometimes diagonal, and it looks like it was carved in a hurry by someone who wasn't particularly concerned with making it pretty. The shaft starts in the grotto, a small natural cave in the bedrock that was incorporated into the pyramid's design. From there, it climbs up through the pyramid's masonry, bypassing all the blocked passages and sealed chambers until it pops out at the bottom of the Grand Gallery. Here's the interesting part. The shaft is rough and unfinished, completely different from the carefully carved passages everywhere else. It looks like it was dug from the inside, tunneled upward through the rock by people who were already inside the pyramid. Which raises an obvious question. Why? The most common theory is that the well shaft was an escape route for the workers who sealed the pyramid after Khufu's funeral. The idea is that after the burial, workers would lower the portcullis stones in the antechamber and slide the granite plugs down the ascending passage, sealing the king's chamber forever. But then, they'd be trapped inside. So, they'd climb down through the well shaft, which had been left open for this purpose, and exit through the descending passage. It's a neat theory, and it makes logical sense. You can't seal a tomb from the inside unless you have a way to get out. The well shaft would solve that problem. But there are some issues with this theory. First, the shaft is really rough, like barely passable in places. If you were planning an escape route, you'd probably make it a bit more comfortable, especially if you're expecting workers to climb 200 feet in the dark while carrying tools. Second, the shaft connects to the grotto, which is a natural cave, which suggests it might have been an existing feature that the pyramid builders incorporated rather than something they dug themselves. Maybe they found this natural vertical crack in the bedrock and decided to use it as a service passage during construction. Third, and this is the real kicker, the shaft was blocked when Al-Mamun's team found it. There were stones filling parts of it, sealing it off. If it was an escape route, why block it after the workers left? Unless the blocking happened later, during one of the many ancient looting expeditions. We don't really know. The well shaft is one of those features that seems like it should tell us something important about how the pyramid was used, but instead it just raises more questions. What we do know is that when Al-Mamun's men found the ascending passage and climbed up to the king's chamber, they also found the well shaft and cleared it out. And after that, the shaft became the standard route for exiting the pyramid. You'd go up through Al-Mamun's tunnel, climb the ascending passage and the Grand Gallery, visit the king's chamber, and then, instead of trying to squeeze back down through the narrow passages, you just climb down the well shaft and exit through the descending passage. It's still used that way today, though modern tourists mostly just go up and back the same way because climbing through a rough vertical shaft in the dark is not everyone's idea of a fun time. The grotto at the bottom of the well shaft is also kind of interesting, though not in a treasure or mystery sort of way. It's just a natural cavity in the bedrock, probably formed by erosion or some geologic process millions of years ago. The Egyptians left it mostly as they found it, though they did carve some niches into the walls and possibly used it as a storage area during construction. Some people have speculated that the grotto was significant to the pyramid's design, maybe as a symbolic connection to the underworld or as part of some structural plan. But it's more likely that it was just there, a convenient natural feature that happened to be in the way, and the builders worked around it rather than removing it.
Not everything has deep symbolic meaning. Sometimes a cave is just a cave. Speaking of things that might not mean anything, let's talk about these so-called air shafts again, because people have been obsessing over these things for decades, and we still don't have a definitive answer about what they're for. As I mentioned earlier, both the Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber have pairs of these narrow shafts running through the pyramid at steep angles. The King's Chamber shafts reach the outside. The Queen's Chamber shafts are blocked by doors, and everyone has an opinion about why. The soul shaft theory is popular because it fits with what we know about Egyptian beliefs. The idea of the Ka ascending to the stars is well documented in Egyptian religious texts. The shafts point towards astronomically significant locations. It all fits together nicely. But then you have to explain why the Queen's Chamber shafts are blocked. If they're meant to allow the soul to escape, why block them? Unless the chamber was never used, which brings us back to the abandoned plan theory. The ventilation theory is practical, but seems unnecessary. Why would you need permanent ventilation in a sealed tomb? Unless the shafts were meant to provide air during construction and then they just left them open because why not? But again, why are the Queen's Chamber ones sealed? Then there are the more exotic theories. Some people think the shafts were part of an energy system, channels for cosmic power or acoustic resonance or electromagnetic fields. These theories usually involve a lot of pseudoscience and misunderstood physics, but they're out there.
And then there are the really out there theories. The shafts were escape routes for tiny people. They were waste chutes. They were part of a water hydraulic system. They were communication tubes. They were designed to focus mystical energy from the cosmos into the burial chamber. They were built by robots. They were never finished because the workers gave up. They're proof of time travel. The internet is a wild place. The most likely explanation, in my opinion, is some combination of practical and symbolic. The shafts might have been useful during construction, providing airflow and maybe even light if they were built early enough in the process. And then they were given symbolic meaning, aligned with the stars to serve as spiritual pathways. The Queen's Chamber shafts were sealed because that chamber was abandoned, and sealing them was part of closing off that section of the pyramid. But that's just my guess. We don't have ancient instruction manuals saying air shafts shall be built for the following reasons. We have to infer purpose from structure, which is always risky because people don't always do things for logical reasons. Sometimes they do things because of tradition, or because someone important insisted, or because it seemed like a good idea at the time. The 2002 exploration of the Queen's Chamber southern shaft, the one where they drilled through the first door and found another door, was supposed to settle this question. Instead, it just made things more complicated. The space between the two doors contained nothing useful. No inscriptions, no objects, just empty space and dust. The shaft continues beyond the second door, but we don't know where it goes or where it ends. In 2011, another robot exploration examined both the northern and southern shafts more thoroughly. They found that the southern shaft's second door has copper handles similar to the first one. The northern shaft's door is different, more finished, more deliberate looking. Beyond it, the shaft continues, but hasn't been fully mapped. So we've got doors leading to more doors, leading to passages, leading to who knows where, and none of it tells us anything definitive. It's like the pyramid is deliberately messing with us. Oh, you want answers? Here's another sealed door. Have fun. This is what makes the Great Pyramid so frustrating for archaeologists. Every time you think you figured something out, you discover another layer of complexity. It's not just a big pile of rocks with a room in the middle. It's a carefully designed structure with multiple chambers and passages and features that serve purposes we can only guess at. And some of those features might not serve any purpose at all. They might be mistakes, abandoned ideas, test runs that didn't work out. The Egyptians were brilliant engineers, but they weren't infallible. They made mistakes. They changed their minds. They tried things that didn't work and had to adapt. Sneferu's bent pyramid is a perfect example of this. They started building at one angle, realized the structure was becoming unstable, and reduced the angle partway up. It looks weird,
but it was a practical solution to a structural problem. They didn't tear it down and start over, they adapted and kept going. The Great Pyramid probably has similar adaptations, design changes that happened during construction, features that were added or removed or modified as the project evolved. We see evidence of this in the different chambers, the sealed shafts, the abandoned spaces. The pyramid we have now is the result of decades of work by people who were figuring things out as they went. But because it's so old and so famous, we tend to assume everything was planned from the beginning, that Khufu and his architects had the entire design finalized before they laid the first stone, and they executed that design perfectly over 20 years. In reality, it probably wasn't like that at all. Big construction projects never are. There are always surprises, always changes, always moments where you have to throw out the original plan and improvise. The Great Pyramid is impressive not because it's perfect, but because they managed to adapt and still end up with something magnificent. Something that has lasted thousands of years and still amazes people today. That's the real achievement. Not perfection, but persistence. Not flawless execution, but the ability to keep going when things don't work out as planned. Which is a nice philosophical takeaway, but it doesn't answer the question of what those shafts are for. So let's just accept that we don't know, add it to the list, and move on.
Modern discoveries and robot explorers. So we've covered the major chambers and passages that have been known for centuries. But the Great Pyramid keeps surprising us. Even in the 21st century, with all our technology, we're still finding new things hidden inside this 4,500-year-old structure. In 2017, an international team of scientists used muon tomography to scan the pyramid. Muons are subatomic particles that rain down from space when cosmic rays hit the atmosphere. They can pass through solid rock, but they're absorbed at different rates depending on the density of the material. By placing detectors inside the pyramid and measuring how many muons make it through, scientists can create a sort of X-ray image of the interior. And they found something. A large void above the Grand Gallery, running parallel to it, about 100 feet long. Just empty space, hidden inside the pyramid structure, completely unknown until 2017. The discovery was announced with great fanfare. "Hidden chamber found in Great Pyramid," the headlines screamed. Finally, proof that there were still secrets waiting to be discovered. Maybe this void contained treasure, or Khufu's real burial chamber, or ancient texts explaining how the pyramid was built. The Egyptian authorities were less enthusiastic. They pointed out that the void might not be a chamber at all. It could just be a structural feature, an intentional gap in the masonry meant to reduce weight on the Grand Gallery below, similar to the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber. That's the boring explanation, but it's also probably correct. The pyramid has lots of these weight-relieving features. The void might just be another one, hidden and forgotten because it was never meant to be accessed. But it also might be more than that. We don't know because we can't see inside it. Muon tomography can tell you there's empty space, but it can't tell you what's in that space or how to get to it. You'd need to drill or tunnel in, and the Egyptian government is understandably reluctant to let anyone start poking holes in the Great Pyramid just to satisfy curiosity. So the void sits there, detected but unexplored, another mystery added to the pile. Maybe someday we'll develop non-invasive technology that can scan inside and tell us what's there. Or maybe we'll just have to accept that some parts of the pyramid will remain unknown. The robot explorations of the shafts in the 1990s and 2000s were another example of modern technology trying to solve ancient mysteries. They sent these little rovers up the narrow passages, equipped with cameras and lights, hoping to find something at the end. And they found doors, just stone doors with copper handles. No inscriptions, no treasure, no explanations, just more obstacles. The robots themselves are kind of adorable in a technological sort of way. Tiny little vehicles with treads or wheels, small enough to fit in an 8-inch shaft, sturdy enough to climb at a 40-degree angle. They look like toys, but they're sophisticated pieces of engineering designed specifically to explore spaces too small and difficult for humans. And they've done good work. We know more about those shafts because of the robot explorations. We know where the doors are, what they look like, what's beyond the first door. We have detailed photos and measurements. It's valuable data, even if it doesn't answer the big questions. There's talk of sending more robots up the shafts, maybe with drills to get through the doors, maybe with better sensors to analyze what's beyond. But it's slow going. Each expedition requires permits and funding and international cooperation, and there's always the risk of damaging the pyramid. So we progress incrementally, one robot mission at a time. In the meantime, we have other technologies helping us understand the pyramid. Ground-penetrating radar has been used to scan the bedrock beneath the pyramid, looking for natural caves or man-made tunnels. They haven't found much. The bedrock is pretty solid, but it's helped rule out some of the wilder theories about secret chambers carved deep underground. 3D scanning and photogrammetry have created incredibly detailed digital models of the pyramid's interior. You can explore these passages virtually, zooming in on individual blocks, examining tool marks and quarry inscriptions. It's not the same as being there, but it's a lot more comfortable and you don't have to crouch. These digital models have revealed things that earlier explorers missed. Tiny details in the stonework, subtle alignments, patterns, and how the blocks were cut and placed. The data's all there, waiting to be analyzed, and every few years someone publishes a new paper pointing out something that's been sitting in plain sight for thousands of years. That's one of the frustrating things about archaeology. The evidence is right there, has been there the whole time, but we're so used to looking at it one way that we miss other interpretations. It takes fresh eyes, new perspectives, different questions to see what's been there all along.
For example, the marks on the stones in the relieving chambers. We've known about them since Weiss found them in the 1830s, but it wasn't until much later that scholars really analyzed them, compared them to quarry marks at other sites, understood what the gang names and dates meant. Information that had been sitting there for 4,500 years, visible for almost 200 years, but only properly understood in the last few decades. The same is probably true for a lot of features in the pyramid. We've documented them, photographed them, measured them, but we haven't necessarily understood them yet. Future archaeologists will look at our work and wonder how we missed such obvious things. That's humbling, but also kind of exciting. It means there's still work to do, still things to discover, even in something as thoroughly explored as the Great Pyramid. But let's shift gears for a bit and talk about the people who've tried to break into this thing over the centuries. Because the history of pyramid exploration is basically a history of people seeing a giant pile of rocks and thinking, I bet there's treasure in there. We've already mentioned Al-Mamun and his tunnel blasting expedition in the 9th century, but he wasn't the first, and he definitely wasn't the last. The pyramid was probably looted not long after it was sealed. Maybe a few decades, maybe a few centuries, but certainly within the Pharaonic period. Ancient Egypt had professional tomb robbers. It was practically a career path. Rich tombs got robbed almost as soon as they were closed, and even the most elaborate security measures, hidden passages, false doors, curse inscriptions, didn't stop determined thieves. The Great Pyramid, being the most elaborate tomb ever built, was an obvious target. The granite plugs blocking the ascending passage were meant to keep robbers out, but they didn't work. The thieves either found a way around them, or more likely, they had inside information. Maybe workers who helped seal the tomb leaked the layout. Maybe priests who performed rituals in the pyramid sold access. Maybe royal officials got bribed. However it happened, the robbers got in. They reached the king's chamber, broke open the sarcophagus, took whatever was inside, and left. We don't know when exactly this happened, but it was definitely before Al-Mamun arrived, because he found the chamber already empty. Some people speculate that the pyramid was looted during one of the chaotic periods in Egyptian history, when central authority collapsed and nobody was protecting the monuments. The first intermediate period, for example, came a few centuries after Khufu's death, and it was marked by political instability and economic decline. Perfect conditions for tomb robbery. Or maybe it happened even earlier, during a period when Khufu's descendants lost power and rival dynasties had no interest in protecting his tomb. Ancient Egypt lasted for 3,000 years. A lot can happen in 3,000 years. Dynasties rise and fall, capitals move, old monuments get forgotten or repurposed. By the time the Romans conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, the pyramids were already ancient. Tourist attractions from a civilization that had ended more than 1,000 years earlier. Roman visitors came to see them, carved graffiti on the walls, marveled at how old everything was. The Greek historian Herodotus visited the pyramids in the 5th century BCE, about 2,000 years after they were built, and he got a tour from local priests who told him all sorts of stories about how they were constructed. Some of those stories might have been accurate. Others were probably made up to impress the tourist. Herodotus wasn't always great at distinguishing between reliable information and entertaining anecdotes. He's the one who recorded the story about 100,000 workers and 20 years of labor, which has become the standard version of events. He also recorded the story about Khufu's daughter raising money through prostitution, which nobody takes seriously. And he claimed that the pyramids were built using machines to lift the stones, which is interesting because we have no evidence of such machines existing. Basically, Herodotus was working from second or third-hand information filtered through cultural and language barriers, and he wrote it all down as fact, which means we have to read him very carefully, taking the general outline as probably accurate, but the details as questionable. Still, his account is valuable because it's one of the few written records we have from someone who actually visited the pyramids when they were still more or less intact. By his time, they'd already lost some of their casing stones and been closed up for centuries, but they hadn't been extensively vandalized yet. That came later, particularly during the medieval period when Cairo was growing and needed building materials. The pyramids were a convenient source of pre-cut limestone, and nobody cared about preserving ancient monuments. So they stripped away the casing stones, hauled them off to build mosques and fortresses, and left the pyramids looking rough and weathered. The Great Pyramid lost about 22 acres worth of casing stones this way. That's an enormous amount of material. If you could gather it all up and put it back, the pyramid would look completely different. Smooth, white, gleaming. Instead, we have the stepped core, exposed and eroded, missing about 30 feet of height and all of its original splendor. Some of those casing stones ended up in famous buildings. The Sultan Hassan Mosque in Cairo, for example, was partially built using limestone from the pyramids. So in a way, the pyramids live on in the city's architecture, just not in the way Khufu intended.
Crack theories and cosmic alignments. Now we need to talk about the more creative interpretations of the Great Pyramid, because there are a lot of them, and they range from interesting but unproven to absolutely buck-wild nonsense. Let's start with the astronomical alignments, which are actually pretty well documented. The pyramid is oriented almost perfectly to the cardinal directions, as I mentioned earlier. The shafts in the king's chamber and queen's chamber point towards specific stars that were significant in Egyptian religion,
The northern shaft points toward the circumpolar stars, which never set and represented eternal life. The southern shaft points toward Orion's belt, associated with Osiris. This is all mainstream archaeology. We know the Egyptians were big on astronomical alignments. They oriented their temples and monuments based on solar and stellar positions. It was part of their religious cosmology. The pyramid being aligned with certain stars is interesting, but it's not mysterious. It's exactly the kind of thing we'd expect them to do. But then you get people who take this and run way too far with it. They start finding alignments that probably aren't intentional, like, oh, the pyramid's height times this arbitrary number equals the distance from the Earth to the Sun, or the perimeter divided by twice the height gives you pi. And sure, if you do enough math with enough different combinations of measurements and numbers, you'll eventually stumble on something that looks meaningful. It's the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. You shoot a bunch of holes in the side of a barn and then paint a bullseye around the tightest cluster. Of course it looks like you were aiming there. You pick that spot after the fact. The pi thing is particularly popular. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height is approximately 6.28, which is close to 2 times pi. Therefore, the ancient Egyptians must have known about pi and encoded it in the pyramid's dimensions. Or, alternatively, they used a rolling measurement tool, like a wheel that they rolled along the ground to measure distances, and the natural result of using such a tool would produce pi-related ratios without them even realizing it, because circles have pi built into them. It's not mystical knowledge, it's just geometry. But that explanation is boring. So, people prefer the mystical version. The Egyptians were secretly advanced mathematicians who knew about pi thousands of years before the Greeks supposedly discovered it. Never mind that we have Egyptian mathematical papyri from this period, and they don't show any special knowledge of pi. Never mind that their calculations were practical and approximate, not abstract and precise. The pyramid contains secret mathematical codes, therefore the Egyptians were geniuses who understood advanced concepts that wouldn't be formally developed for millennia. This kind of thinking annoys actual Egyptologists because it treats ancient people like they were either idiots who couldn't build anything without help or secret geniuses who possessed knowledge beyond their time. Neither is true. Ancient Egyptians were regular humans who were very good at practical problem solving. They learned through trial and error, passed knowledge from generation to generation, and gradually developed more sophisticated techniques. They didn't need to know pi to build a pyramid. They needed to know how to cut stone, move heavy objects, organize large work crews, and make sure the structure wouldn't collapse. Those are impressive enough skills without adding mystical mathematics on top. But the numerology people won't let it go. They've measured every dimension of the pyramid and every possible unit and found dozens of relationships with mathematical constants, historical dates, astronomical distances, you name it. Some people claim the pyramid's dimensions encode the speed of light. Others say it predicts the date of the apocalypse. Others say it's a scale model of the northern hemisphere. None of this holds up to scrutiny. The measurements don't work if you use the original dimensions of the pyramid before it lost its capstone and casing stones. The relationships only appear if you massage the numbers and ignore significant figures, and the predictions only look impressive because you're reading them after the fact. It's the same problem with Nostradamus' prophecies or the Bible code. You can find whatever you're looking for if you're creative enough with interpretation and willing to ignore all the times it doesn't work. Then we have the even wilder theories. The pyramid as a power plant, the pyramid as a water pump, the pyramid as a giant resonance chamber. These usually involve misunderstanding how physics works and assigning magical properties to geometric shapes. The power plant theory, for example, claims that the pyramid was designed to generate electricity using aquifers beneath the structure, chemical reactions in the chambers, and crystalline properties of limestone and granite. The shafts were apparently conduits for this energy, which was then transmitted wirelessly across Egypt to power ancient cities. This is nonsense for so many reasons. There's no evidence of electrical equipment, the chambers don't show signs of chemical processes, limestone and granite don't have the properties needed for power generation, and wireless power transmission doesn't work the way the theory describes. You can't just beam electricity through the air over long distances without massive energy loss and safety hazards. But the theory persists because it sounds cool, and it involves pyramids, which people think are mystical. Never mind that we have zero evidence of ancient Egyptians using electricity for anything. Never mind that they clearly used oil lamps and candles for light, exactly like you'd expect from a Bronze Age civilization. The pyramid was secretly a power plant, because that's more exciting than tomb. The water pump theory is slightly more plausible, but still wrong. The idea is that the pyramid used hydraulic principles to lift water from the Nile, possibly using the subterranean chamber as a reservoir. The passages would have been flooded, and some kind of pump mechanism would have raised water to higher levels.
There are a few problems with this. First, there's no evidence of water damage or limestone erosion that would indicate prolonged flooding. The passages are dry and have been for as long as anyone's recorded. Second, why would you build a 6 million ton water pump? That's the most over-engineered plumbing system in human history. Third, the chambers are too high above the Nile for basic hydraulic principles to work without modern equipment. But people like this theory because it makes the pyramid functional rather than symbolic. It gives it a purpose beyond big tomb for dead king. And I get the appeal of that. Tombs are for dead people. Power plants and water pumps are useful. We like useful things. But the pyramid was a tomb. That's what pyramids were for. The entire Old Kingdom period was defined by pyramid building, and all of them were tombs. Khufu built a tomb. It's not that complicated. The resonance chamber theory is newer and involves claiming that the pyramid's internal structure was designed to amplify sound or vibrations at specific frequencies. The king's chamber, with its granite walls and flat ceiling, supposedly has unique acoustic properties. You can generate standing waves in there, and the chamber will resonate at certain frequencies. This is actually true. The king's chamber does have interesting acoustic properties. It's a hard-walled rectangular space, and sound behaves in specific ways in such spaces. If you make certain noises, the chamber will resonate. You can feel it vibrating. But that's not evidence that it was designed as a resonance chamber. Any similar space would have similar properties. It's just physics. Hard walls reflect sound, and if the dimensions happen to create standing waves at certain frequencies, you'll get resonance. That doesn't mean the Egyptians were trying to create some kind of sonic healing temple or communication device. Though, of course, some people think exactly that. They claim the pyramid was used for meditation and spiritual experiences, induced by exposing people to specific sound frequencies in the king's chamber, which is a lovely New Age idea, but there's no historical evidence for it. The ancient Egyptians left extensive records about their religious practices. We know what they did in temples. We know how they performed funerary rites. We know what they believed about the afterlife. None of it involves sonic vibration meditation chambers. But historical evidence doesn't stop people from believing what they want to believe. If you want the pyramid to be a mystical temple where ancient priests achieved higher consciousness through acoustic resonance, you can convince yourself that's true. You just have to ignore everything we actually know about Egyptian religion and focus on the fact that sound bounces around in a granite room. There's also the ancient aliens crowd, who think the pyramid couldn't possibly have been built by humans and must have involved extraterrestrial technology. This theory is insulting to the Egyptians and also makes no sense. Why would aliens come to Earth and build pyramids? What purpose does that serve? If they have the technology for interstellar travel, why would they mess around with stone blocks? Why not use advanced materials? Why make it look like something humans could theoretically build just really well? And if aliens did build the pyramids, why are there so many mistakes and evidence of learning? Why does Sneferu's bent pyramid have that weird angle change? Why are there rough patches and tool marks and abandoned features? Wouldn't alien construction be perfect? The aliens theory only works if you refuse to give humans credit for their own achievements. It's based on the assumption that Bronze Age people couldn't possibly figure out how to stack rocks really high, which is absurd. Humans have been stacking things since we evolved. It's one of our core competencies. Given enough time and labor, we can stack rocks into very impressive configurations. The Great Pyramid is amazing because humans built it. That's the whole point. It represents what we can accomplish with organization, planning, and persistence.
Taking that away and attributing it to aliens diminishes one of humanity's great achievements. But the aliens theories sell books and get views on YouTube, so they're not going anywhere. There will always be people who prefer exciting nonsense over boring facts. And look, I get it. History can be disappointing. You want ancient civilizations to be mysterious and advanced and full of secrets. You want there to be lost knowledge and hidden chambers and artifacts that prove everything we thought we knew was wrong. But real history is better than made-up history. Real ancient Egyptians were fascinating people with complex beliefs and impressive skills. They developed sophisticated organizational systems, mastered difficult engineering challenges, and created art and architecture that has lasted thousands of years. That's interesting. That's worth studying and appreciating. You don't need to add aliens or mysticism or power plants to make it compelling. The pyramid is compelling on its own. A 6 million ton stone structure built with copper tools and human labor, standing for 4,500 years, still largely intact, still full of unanswered questions. That's the mystery. Not hidden codes or secret chambers, but the simple question of how regular people accomplished something so extraordinary. And we're still trying to answer that question, still experimenting with different construction techniques, still running simulations, still arguing about the details. Which is how archaeology works. Slowly, carefully, always willing to revise based on new evidence. It's less exciting than aliens theories, but it's how we actually learn things.